Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the next edition of AmiSights. I'm Ami Kisar, your host, along with my co-host, Lynn Ozer, a.k.a. SBA Queen. Today, I'm so excited to have my friend, Pramod Raheja, who survived the EO Grit On conference with me a couple of weeks ago, to share with us his story and his journey and all about his company and what he's done and how he's gotten here, and just a fun conversation. And thanks for being here, buddy.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Appreciate the invite.
So, I want you to start back a little ways from the sort of beginning and tell me when exactly the entrepreneurial bug bit you.
Okay. Well, I'll start with being a little kid, about 4 or 5 years old, where I had spaceships and airplanes all over my walls. So that the passion for some of what I'm doing now is throughout my career was always there. But I would say from the entrepreneur perspective, probably at some point in high school and in early college, just kind of came up with ideas to, do this or that, or make T-shirts and sell them, you just kind of throughout the youth years, I'll call them, not knowing it. Back in those days, like we'll call it the 80s, I'm solid Gen X. There was no major for entrepreneurship in colleges as they are now. So
right.
there was nothing like, oh, you're going to go start a business. And I did a technical degree. I did an engineering degree, but I as I got later in my career and my life, as I was becoming more of an entrepreneur, I realized I liked sales. And again, nobody said when you're 16 years old, well, you could have a career in sales if you want, and there was nothing like that, right? It was, a business degree to college was a business degree, right? It wasn't like any kind of sales focus or anything like that. And not nowadays, if you look at some of the universities and colleges and the more progressive ones, they'll have like sales tracks and things like that, which is really great. And entrepreneurship tracks, things
Yeah,
like that.
really.
Yeah.
I know. We
Yeah.
missed out on that. So you went to school with a business degree in college?
No, I
or you
did. I
didn't?
I actually did aerospace engineering as a degree
My,
with a big what I would call interest in business, right?
okay.
And in entrepreneurship.
Okay, aerospace engineering. That's not one we've had before.
So yeah, when I was, in college, it's interesting. I always like wanted to be an entrepreneur, even though, like I said, there wasn't like necessarily a support system for that. Now of course there's, even in my alma mater, I sit on the board of advisors for University of Maryland alumni, and I also sometimes, coach or mentor young entrepreneurs out of the university or judge a competition or what have you. There's such a support system now for people that say, hey, I really have an idea and I think I can solve this problem, and there's early stage money, there's early stage coaching, mentoring, all that, was never there back in those days. But I can still go back and remember very vividly being about 21 years old saying, hey, I'm going to be an entrepreneur and CEO someday. So, I mean, that's, was kind of in the, I'd say, you say, how take me back. That was kind of in that psyche, was there. In fact, I did a minor in Japanese because I thought I was going to go work for Boeing or something. And at that time, they were working with many Japanese, what I would call vendors, to put together a Boeing aircraft. And I figured, oh, if I learn Japanese, then I'll move up the ladder and be an executive. So I just sort of did it. Now I don't remember most of it, unfortunately, because I didn't
Because you didn't use it, right?
use it. But I did go to Japan about a year ago, my wife and I, for about 2 weeks, and she had never really seen me speak Japanese. And I kind of brushed up on, some simple things to get around the country.
Yeah.
And she was pretty impressed. And so being married 30 years and impressing your wife, that's a feat in
new
itself.
thing.
Don't challenge me.
That's great. So anyway, you get an aerospace degree, and then what do you do?
I became a pilot.
Oh.
And so little, maybe somewhat known fact, I actually still fly. So while I'm running a company, I will sometimes on weekends go and fly somewhere. And so, like, for example, last weekend I was in Lisbon, Portugal. Went there on Friday night and came back on Sunday afternoon. I was there for the whole day.
You flew there.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I became a pilot and then started a business, going back to my early days as a pilot, I was selling things on the side. So that was like, I would call, small little side hustles, we'll call them, until I would say my late 20s. Then I became a consultant. I started a consulting company, which then I would call that my first real business, where I wasn't just side hustling, and I was working with large entities to bring in safety paradigms to healthcare systems. So coming out of aviation, we use very specific communication systems on the flight deck that help improve safety. So I'll give you an example. How to brief somebody, like, so briefings and communication words and styles, and also a very specific methodology to prevent bad things from happening. So I started a consulting business taking that same paradigm to healthcare, and started working with large healthcare systems in different parts of the country. And so that was I would call my first like real business. Like I was probably 28 or 29 years old, and I was like, but then fast forward a few years, I had found a franchise I really liked, and decided to buy it. Grew it to 4 locations. In fact, my first location, I did work with the SBA. I got an SBA Express loan, which I know you guys are very familiar with, and that helped kind of get me off the ground. And
Which franchise? Is it still around or you started
that
it?
one, yeah, it is. Yeah, there's one actually in Philly. It's called Intelligent Office, and it's basically, if you've never heard of it, think of it like WeWork, but pre-WeWork, not necessarily just co-working, but private offices, and a very big, we'll call IT communications aspect to it. So you end up becoming a corporate presence for small companies. So one time I had 4 locations, probably 1,000 plus clients amongst those 4 locations. I ended up selling out of it, and then starting this company that I have now, about 2017 or so.
So what were the biggest challenges and what made you decide to sell?
So I actually had stepped out of the day-to-day role of that company in about 2012, handed those reins over to a partner of mine. And so stayed on the board, stayed an owner, but at some point I said, hey, you know what? I'm not really involved anymore, and I'm ready to move on. And so I would say that was the driver, was to say I'm ready to move on. The locations that I had, they're still there. They're still in Northern Virginia, is where I was running them, and for a long time. And so they're still there. And yeah, I just wanted to, it's time and by the way, the company I'm starting now really kind of falls into my passions anyways, right? So aerospace, I'm kind of a buff about anything that flies. So anything that flies, goes into space, whatever, I really get into the nitty gritty of it. And I have the ability to take that technical concepts and make them, very simple to explain to somebody. So, with the engineering background, but I'm not really an engineer anymore. So I kind of am more of a sales guy. And so I'm able to take something and boil it down to something simple so somebody can understand it.
Boy, I could use you.
Wow.
Now, wait, one question here. When you said you flew to Portugal do you fly commercial or it's all
I do.
private?
Yeah. No, I fly a 777 as a captain for a large carrier.
How about it? So you get to pick and choose at this point in your career when you want to fly? I think that's pretty neat.
Well, we do monthly schedules, and because I'm an entrepreneur,
Right.
my focus is really on being off during the week and being available for conferences and things that I need to be at and go to,
Right.
and so that's what drives my scheduling. Now my kids are all grown up, so I'm able to do this sort of dual career kind of thing. In fact, on LinkedIn, somebody did a thing on me. It's some guy on LinkedIn. He does this thing where he profiles dual careerists, as he calls them.
Uh-huh.
So he's a Navy captain, but he's also a musician and as a professional. So he's a dual careerist as a Navy captain and a musician. And then he profiles people that do more than one thing, because he's fascinated with that sort of aspect of how do you excel at more than one thing, and how do you do it. In my case, my kids are growing up. My wife and I are empty nesters, and so from a time perspective, I'm able to balance it. That being said, there are things I don't do. Right, I don't mow the lawn. I don't, I don't do. My wife fixes all the things around the house. Right, so
But she gets to go to Portugal for the weekend with you.
she does, and she might do that next
That's
weekend.
pretty exciting. No, I mean, that's really nice. Okay, so back to the business. So when you're not flying and you're running the business that you have now, tell us about that and how many people do you
Ye-
employ and
Yeah, and by the way, the the business kind of encompasses like all the time, right? It's even when I'm gone on layovers and things like that, I'll be, working and things and doing what I need to do. So we went through a journey, I will say. We went through what I would call, the grit journey. And one of the reasons I think Ami has put together what he has is because he saw many of these stories of companies, going through ups and downs and struggling and things like that, through COVID and beyond. And in our case, I would say we are in an early stage industry. So the interesting thing is when I co-founded the company, I thought, wow, I hope we're not late to the game. That was one of my thoughts. What I realized was we were nowhere near late to the game. In fact, some of the technology we were developing was too far ahead of the market. So if you think about a company that's starting something, creating something that's never been done before, and you're trying to find product market fit, and you think you have it, you don't always have it. So I'll give you an example. When we started the company, we were developing a drone that we felt like would be a game changer for logistics, medical deliveries, supplies, things like that, right? Cargo type thing. And then we kind of did what I would call, if you've ever heard of the book Blue Ocean Strategy, we kind of did our own little blue ocean exercise. It's a book, great book, by the way. You don't need to read the book to understand the concept, but you can. The concept basically is when you're starting something like a business, you got to figure out, well, who is my competition? What is my competition? Am I playing in an ocean where there's so much competition that it's red, it's bloodied, everybody's battling each other, and it's just going to be super challenging? Or do I have some blue where there's an opportunity space? And yes, of course, there's going to be some competition. In fact, you want competition because it tells you that there's a market there. But is there enough of an area for me to make a name for myself and to get into that opportunity space easier, right? So we were fortunate to get some opportunities from the Department of Homeland Security that said, "Hey, they said we really like your designs. You should apply for this solicitation." So we did. When we got selected, we were one of two drone companies out of maybe 200 that applied that got selected for what they called a smart cities program. And the idea was, let's build drone technology that can go into indoor areas and urban canyons like cities, and be able to like do search and rescue if there's like an earthquake or what have you, and send the drone in before the human, so we can survey and we can see if there's survivors or whatever the use case may be. And so we got selected for this, not having actually done that. And part of the deal was the money that they were giving us was designed to develop this technology over the next 2 years. This was in 2019, 18, 19. So we actually developed robust technology that actually met their requirements. We met every milestone. We have letters from DHS saying how well we performed, and, by all means, good success and traction. But the idea was that you would kind of graduate from that and go talk to all these public safety entities now and, try to get business.
Right.
But what ended up happening is the drone technology that we developed, while it was superior to anything on the market, was much more expensive too, right? So at that time, the public safety entities were like, "Well, we're okay with our status quo, okay drone from China that is, a few $1,000s versus your 10x, drone that's going to cost 10x more." And so the product market fit was there from a technology perspective, but it wasn't there from a price perspective, right? So we went a different direction and said, well, you know what we're doing is a great fit for big enterprise commercial companies, like engineering companies doing surveying and going into tanks and tunnels and having to go inspect things instead of, again, sending humans in. That was more costly, more dangerous. So the ROI was definitely there. However, when we did that sort of approach, these companies were buying, one, maybe two drones, things like that. And it just wasn't like volume that you could count on to sustain your business. So we went through some pretty rough times until now. Fast forward to, I'm not a big fan of war by any means, but war typically drives technology acceleration. And you can see that if you just pick up the newspaper or, well, look online,
Mhm.
and nobody reads the newspaper, but
Right.
look online
Right.
and see all the things that are happening with drones around the world, and specifically
Yes.
the Ukraine
Right.
conflict
Right.
started it all. So I would say now, let's go back a few years to 2024 even. The United States bought 100,000 drones from various companies for the Department of Defense. Contrast that to China and Russia that had probably 2 million plus that were being, bought and used in different ways and capacities. Turkey also had quite a few, and other countries. So we were way behind. It wasn't until last year in the fall, really late summer, fall, that things started to change. So my company now has some tailwinds, obviously, because of things happening. But as you know, we have a entrepreneurs channel that we talk about grit and problems and things like that. And I think I was in there last year at some point saying, yeah, hey, we have debt and we're trying to figure out how to navigate this, and we're trying to figure out how to stay in business and things like that, right? And fortunately, we got through that, or we call it as the valley of death. We got through the valley of death and are kind of coming out, on the other side, climbing the mountain now to where we have some push and some tailwinds that are helping us, and some business as well, with the government.
When you did the first drone and they said it was too expensive, and you said that part of the contract was paying for what research and development or design. Did you get a patent on your drone? That was all
hmm
part of it. So your
Yeah, we
technology is different from any other drone company?
Yeah, so here's the thing. When we started the company, we spun out of the University of Maryland. My co-founder was working on some specific intellectual property. That's how we met. We met through the university. The entrepreneur in residence at the time was a friend of mine, and he was working with my co-founder because my co-founder was faculty. And typically, these two big universities they have a kind of a commercial transition program. So, say you're a professor or at a university, and you work for the university. Technically, if you develop something unique,
They get it.
technically they're going to
They
say, "Hey,
own it.
we own that." But
Right.
they also
Right.
realize, look, we can't do anything without you. So then what they do is they work out an agreement with you. They say, "Hey, tell you what, we own this, but we're going to give you, Lynn, the exclusive license to your technology that you
That's nice.
developed,
Thank
and
you.
we'll keep." And then the negotiation is they'll keep maybe a piece of the company, or they want some royalties or
Right.
whatever. And that's kind of how it all works. And so we did that. We did that with our initial IP. But then as the company grew and we started coming up with new things, then we had our own patents as well
I understand.
that are
Okay.
100% company owned
Okay.
versus, university owned. And so what I'm describing to you for the search and rescue, to answer your question
Right.
directly, was our intellectual property. Yes. And the drone had certain characteristics and things that are very unique, and hence why the patent was issued.
Right.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Why don't you
So
talk about, if you can, like where you are today as a company and what your biggest challenges or opportunities are today?
Yeah, sure. So we're a company that came out of near death experience, and we were bigger and we shrunk, and so we're pretty small, less than 10 people right now, but growing.
how large
Yeah,
were
again,
you?
we probably had 20 at one time. So
Okay.
we, grew to,
You were double what
that.
you
Yeah. And we're also dependent on contractors and things like that we want to bring back in house, which will happen with the right funding and contracts and things like that. So where we are right now in terms of the business is we have some very good traction with certain clients in the Department of War. And one of the things that defines our company is that we're a company that is very innovative. We do a lot of stuff that's probably ahead of the market. The good news, a few years ago, that was not like desirable. Like, you could go out and get SIBRs, if you guys are familiar with the small business innovation research type of contracts that the government gives out. So we've gotten a few of those. They're basically designed for, something the government might be looking for that doesn't necessarily exist, or they want to improve on a certain problem. So we were getting some of those types of contracts, but they're not ever like big money. What you really want to do is get to a program of record where you're producing something, and the government's buying it, right? And in our case, of course, it's drones. And so now we're at a point where we have some drones that are very high. The other thing that the government uses when they're evaluating technology, they use a scale. The scale is called TRL, or stands for Technology Readiness Level. And based on where you are in that scale, if you're low on that scale, if you're like, so it goes through 1 through 9. If you're like a 1, that means, well, I have an idea, and here's a picture of it, right? And 9 is, okay, this is usable in an operational theater, right, of a military context. And so now we have, technology that's at 8, 9 level, right? And drones that are, at an 8, 9 level. So to answer your question, Ami, yeah, we are directly selling now. We're not at a point where we're doing scale or program of record just yet, but we're working on that. And that is, becoming, a lot of the government rules in the last year have changed quite a bit as well, where they were doing a certain type of contracting and they've made it a little bit easier. It is still chaos. Don't get me wrong. There's still like, where do I do? Where do I go? What do I do? There's still a lot of that, but it's getting easier to sort of get your foot in the door and be seen, and then, work towards a contract, things like that. And then if you're a company like ours that actually has technology that you can demonstrate, then you start getting invited to technology experimentation events and things like that, where the government stakeholders can see your technology in action and say, okay, hey, I want that. And so we've done that now over the past year a few times where it's led to good, good things in terms of progress. So
Are you manufacturing these?
so we build we do low rate manufacturing, meaning we build prototypes and we could do a few units and things like that. However, no, I have a couple of manufacturing partners for the scaling. So we have one that's kind of does more smaller scale manufacturing here in Virginia, and then we have a larger one in Arizona as well.
But it's
And
all made here in the United States.
it's all made in the United States, correct? Yeah, yeah. So we are a U.S. based company. We're a global company in terms of being who we can sell to. But
Right.
yeah, we are a U.S. company, and we are one of the biggest things in my world is your supply chain. There's a big emphasis on using supply chain of friendly countries, and so they're becoming pretty strict about that. So we have been
I would
careful to
assume
be as
so.
careful as possible, and yeah, they call it for any of your listeners, NDA compliant. So National Defense Authorization Act compliant.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If
It's
you could
very
look
interesting.
fascinating. If you could look forward 6 months or a year, what do you see? If things go well, like what are your challenges going to be? What are your opportunities going to be? What are your current restraints, etc.?
Yeah, so I definitely foresee the opportunity to scale what we'll call production of these, widgets, in our case, drones, right? Scale production of our drones. And then the challenges that come with that, of course, are growth. Now, well, capital first, right? So as you're growing, in the kind of world I'm in, capital is just, you got to feed the beast, right? So, we just brought in a new investor not that long ago, which has helped us quite a bit. And then from that, we'll we'll have to grow our investment as well. But I'd like to see, I mean, what I can see is definitely some larger contracts that help us, help us grow. We're actually working on one right now that could be very good. And then the challenges, of course, become the scaling, but it also becomes, yeah, I would say scaling is the biggest challenge at that point. Like it's, capital and resources, making sure you have the right talent. The good news is we're pretty good at recruiting talent and finding talent, but
That's
you still have to
interesting.
have the resources to bring them on. So that's the biggest challenge for
Are
us, I think,
most of
right
your
now.
contracts private or government?
Government.
They are
Yeah.
mostly government.
So we are a dual use company. If you look at a lot of the defense companies, they're called dual use. In fact, we were one of the first. So we were in the first ever Air Force Labs accelerator program 6 years ago in 2020. The Air Force decided to put together this accelerator. They looked at 400 companies. They picked 10. We were one of them. And they said, we're going to pick, what we think are 10 promising dual use companies. And so dual use implies you're selling both, to the governments and you're
Probably
selling to the
private. Yeah,
commercial sector. Yeah. But the reality is, a small company can't do both effectively. You have to kind of pick your battles and also pick your focus areas. So we have picked government because that's where the growth is. That's where the acceleration is. So if I go to a commercial company right now, they might say, "Hey, Pramod, we really like that drone that you built, and we can use that. We're going to buy a couple from you." Where the government might say, "Same thing, but we're going to buy 100." Right? So I've got to go where the market is. So
of course.
yeah.
Yeah.
But so we see a lot of potential in the commercial sector for both Fortune 500s and also going back to public safety for delivering things, getting medical supplies to remote areas, things like that. Because part of what we do is we do heavy lift contested logistics, meaning essentially, carrying things from point A to point B. That's simply what we're doing, right? And so if you think about it in the context of the way it's done now, especially in the military, they'll use a helicopter. The helicopter has lots of noise, it flies higher, you have a human on board. Part of our mission is reduce the risk to humans. Do something with an autonomous system where you don't have to have a human on board. So if
Right.
anything happens,
Right.
you obviously haven't lost the person. And then the drones are, of course, much cheaper than a helicopter. So if you lose the drone, it's still a much lower cost than, the risk that you put the helicopter in. Right. And so so we've had the fortune to fly and do different things. In fact, we were also selected, which was pretty what I would call competitive. Went to Israel a few years ago and flew in the desert and directly with the Israeli Ministry of Defense, and they evaluated our technology, and at the time they were like this, and we weren't even that far along at that time, but they liked it quite a bit. So we were working with both the Pentagon and the irregular warfare technology. I mean, sorry, and the IMOD, showing these things and drones that were doing various autonomous type things. And so yeah, so we've had a interesting journey. it's been a challenge, but wrapping that all up to what Ami asked, I see a pretty bright future, Ami. I think we still have hurdles personally in our company that we have to go through, and there's still a journey. But as far as the industry and as far as what I think we can accomplish, yeah, I see high growth.
I just want to ask you a question. Are you more involved in the technology part of the business or running the business? Are you working
I'm
in your business or on your business? And
That's a
who
great
who
question.
wor who
Yeah.
runs the business end?
Yeah. Right now, I run the business end,
You do.
and I do as the CEO, and essentially we'll call it, COO. But ideally, as we grow, one thing we'd love to have is a proper chief operating officer that can kind of take over more. President and chief operating officer can take over more of the day to day, while I focus on more of the CEO role. CEO role. However, I will say in the last month we've brought in some people that are helping us with program management, which has been essential and really helping out. So that actually has taken some things off my plate because I was kind of doing that essentially as well, and that's starting to help. I can see the light, we'll say, so to speak, where you're not necessarily focused on every little detail.
Yeah.
And yeah,
And I mean, your passion for, anything that flies makes me think that you wanna be involved in the
well,
design, technology, and so forth, as opposed to the day-to-day operations of running the business.
yeah, I 100%, I do geek out, we'll call it. In fact, I don't know if I think the bio I sent you, it says half sales guy, half geek, because I do enjoy the engineering aspects of it all, and I am in on those meetings many times. But that's mainly so that I can, speak to our clients intelligently as well,
Yeah,
right? So I have an
yeah,
understanding of what's going on. I'm in the loop, but I don't get into the weeds for obvious reasons, so I can stay focused on the big picture and the
right,
high level
right,
stuff and sales and business development. But yes, you're spot on. I do enjoy it.
right. That's great. It's fascinating, and it's everything you hear and read about now. Of course, lots of it is upsetting, and,
Yeah, yeah.
the reasons that we need them and the reasons that the market for you has grown so much, and it's a little scary.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but the world, I'd say from a technology perspective of using drones has changed, not just from warfare, but it's going to change in many things. So if you read the new, if you look at the news, you'll see there are, like they call them urban air mobility, right? Which is these bigger vehicles that will fly people like air taxis, right? And I still think that's a little ways away because there's a lot of challenges in the national aerospace system. One of the things that being a pilot has helped with this world of building a drone company is the knowledge I already have from aviation operations and discipline and aviation decision making, and also understanding all the aspects of regulation, regulatory risk, as well as policy and airspace and all those things that come into it. And I'll tell you a funny story. I went to a meeting when I started this company. It was 2018. I went to a meeting downtown Washington D.C. with an organization called the Consumer Telecom Industries Association, and everybody was there. You can think of AT&T, Verizon, Amazon, and I think I was one of the few tiny little startups in the room. And there's a guy from NASA Ames that got up there, and he put this big map out, and he goes, "Hey, by 2021, we are going to have drones flying all over the place in the national airspace system, and it's going to be integrated with airplanes right now." Right. And I was like, wow, that's cool, but that's pretty aggressive. We're in 2026. We're nowhere near that, by the way. So in our world, regulatory risk is a real thing. Right. Which is why we actually, when we started working with DHS, as I was telling you the story, we were building more of an indoor drone. We didn't have to deal with the FAA and regulatory risk and things like that. Now that we're building bigger drones, we're kind of went full circle to where we started. We do have to deal with that. But in the
Right.
context of the military, we don't, because we're typically
Yeah.
flying, on military bases and things like that at the moment, at least. So there are still hurdles you have to jump through in terms of certifications and authorizations, but it's easier and kind of goes faster than if you're dealing on the civilian side of things, because the military is in a
Right.
rush to get things done, right? So
Yes.
Fascinating. I'm
It
so
is fascinating, you're right.
so much for sharing the story and your experience. Do you see this as being your last rodeo, or do you think you have others ahead of you?
no, definitely not my last rodeo. I think so. That's a great question, actually. I mean, because I've thought about that quite a bit. I see this industry, we'll call it the aerospace industry. So when I graduated in 1991 from aerospace engineering, there was nothing going on. Like the space shuttle program had been killed. The moon stuff was, way past. We hadn't been done any of the Apollo stuff in years, and like, whatever, 20 years or what have you. And so all my classmates, I went and became a pilot because that was a passion I had, and I'm glad I did. I'm very glad I did that. But many of my classmates didn't even get into aerospace. Many of them now are like, a couple went to NASA and they had full careers at NASA, but a lot of them are like, senior vice president of IT at Capital One or something like that. They're like in IT and other jobs, but they still have this passion. In fact, one of my friends, he's a finance entrepreneur, a very successful guy. He lives in Dubai. I went to college with him. He did aerospace engineering, but he got into finance and buying companies and doing M&As and things like that. He called me out of the blue like a year and a half ago and said, "Hey," 2 years ago almost, I guess now. And he said, "Hey, man, I miss aerospace. I want to kind of find out what's going on with you and live it through you," kind of thing. Right. So we've stayed in touch and he's
Mm.
made some introductions and things for me. And yeah, Ami, to answer your question, even if we sell this company or merge it or what have you, which is very likely at some point, I'll still stay involved, whether it's this company or, starting something else. Or, at this point, I think I've gained a skill set that allows me to be an executive, and, I might package that and go see if I can work with somebody else in an early stage company or a company where I think I can add value. I always tell people, and I think you probably appreciate this. You can be an entrepreneur, but it doesn't mean you're necessarily a CEO. Like you got to learn that skill set. You got to learn the skill set to lead, right? Still, hence why we are an EO and things like that, so we can learn and be better, to become better and better and better.
Right.
Fascinating story, buddy. Thanks for sharing, and thanks for coming to the tree houses with us.
Yeah, that was a great time. I stayed in one of those tree houses on the other side of the gorge there, the river, and yeah, I really enjoyed that experience. Yeah, just there were bugs and stuff there, but outside of that, it was pretty cool.
Who
Yeah,
bugs
we
you
heard
catch?
about
We
those
are in the
bugs.
woods. We're in the woods.
Yeah,
Yeah, but yeah.
I so appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time. I know your time is valuable, and I really
I
appreciate you.
appreciate it. It was great
Thank
meeting you.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Love
Lynn. Thank you,
talking to
Ami.
you.